Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show. It's hard to believe, but 20 years has gone by since Al Gore and George W. Bush duked it out in Florida for the presidency. Time goes by really quick, I'm afraid. And I was just looking at some of the pictures from the Brooks Brothers Riot, and everybody looks a lot younger back then, that's for sure, and they've got a lot more hair. And on the phone with us from Washington, D.C. is Nat Wienecke, an old colleague of mine in the Bush administration, and Nat is now the Senior Vice President for Federal Government Relations and Political Engagement at the American Property Casualty Insurance Association. And Nat, does it seem like 20 years?
Matt, it's great to be with you this morning. It seems like yesterday. I'm thankful I still have most of my hair, although not all of it. But gosh, it's gone by so fast, and I'm reminded of those days with the president's challenges to the current election and all the work that his folks are doing to make sure all the votes are counted. It really has come back with just a thunderbolt for me.
Let me kind of set the stage. This was around November 22nd in 2000. You guys are on the campaign. It's at the Miami-Dade County office, the elections office, where they're canvassing the elections. And I remember Sweeney, right? John Sweeney and Roger Stone were involved with all this, but kind of set the stage. How did you get involved with it? How did you hear about it? And what exactly were you guys told to do when you went down there?
Sure. So I had been a staffer for a conservative Republican from Indiana on Capitol Hill. And come about August, I decided I really needed to take a pause from that work and go down and get involved in the election. It was really important to me to change the direction of our country at the time. So I went down to Florida and joined then Governor Bush's campaign. Fast forward, Election Day happens, and each one of us that were on the campaign staff got assigned a county for a recount. I did several of those, and then things all went haywire in Miami-Dade, and so a bunch of us descended on Miami-Dade County, a matched lap currently with the American Conservative Union and a bunch of others, to make sure the vote was fairly counted because we knew that it was a Democrat-dominated canvassing board, and we were just real worried there was going to be some cheating going on with those hanging chads, and sure enough, I'm really glad we were there to make sure the count was fair.
Why did they call it the Brooks Brothers Riot?
Yeah, it was a lot of very young former, either current or former congressional staff or activists, and it was at the time, probably 80% male crowd, and we were all wearing our khaki pants and a button-down Oxford shirt, and some folks actually had penny loafers on. I had penny loafers on, although I didn't have pennies in them. But, we just looked like an advertisement out of the Brooks Brothers catalog.
So it was a lot of people said that the whole thing was organized to shut the count down. And they actually did shut the recount down early, didn't they?
Yeah, so that's not, I don't think, a fair characterization about what we were doing. The fact of the matter is, that morning that the quote-unquote Brooks Brothers Riot happened, the canvassers in Miami-Dade County, against the law, closed the counting room to observers. It's a lot like what the Trump campaign experienced in Detroit and Philadelphia and Milwaukee and other places. They literally, the law said we were allowed to be in the room, observe them, determining whether a Chad was hanging or not in that election, and they locked us out of the room. And so, our protest was to ensure that they followed the law and let observers in the room. And sure enough, our voice was heard. They very briefly stopped the counting, maybe for an hour or so, and then they let the observers back in. And not that long afterwards was when the court started to take over, and some of these decisions were made in then Governor Bush's favor.
At what point did we see the pictures of guys like Bolton sitting there with a canvasser? There'd be the Republican and Democrat at the table, and then there'd be the elections official, and they had like magnifying glasses, and they were looking at the paper ballots and the pregnant Chad, the dimpled Chad, the hanging Chad, all that stuff. At what point was that all going on?
So, Matt, it really started almost immediately as the recount started. We realized that Florida's election process was flawed. They've since reformed it. It's probably the best in the country now, after that debacle. But the recount started, and you started to see these counties that were using the Chad-based ballots. And not every county did, and we started seeing problems materialize in those counties where you had these elections boards that were generally one-party controlled, and they were essentially, you look at the ballot, it didn't look like anything was punched out on the ballot, and they would hold it up to the light for 5 minutes, say, "Oh, I see a little dimple on there. This had to be a vote for Gore," and we started seeing that almost immediately, and then as it became more clear how many votes than Al Gore needed to get, it got more egregious over time, and I think the efforts on both sides to make sure the observers were there to challenge those what I viewed at the time and still view today as kind of nefarious activities. I'm thankful that we were successful.
So it sounds like we've seen this movie before. Then people not allowed in to closely observe the recounts, shenanigans with the ballots. The candidates, the candidates ahead, and then suddenly the candidates behind, and
Matt, there are a lot of folks on TV and radio right now who are kind of trying to redefine what happened in Miami 20 years ago, and to say essentially that the Bush team was calling to count every ballot, which we certainly were, but we also wanted every legal ballot counted, and we didn't want illegal ballots counted. And there was an effort to have ballots inserted into the count that was certainly not clear what the intent of the voter was whatsoever. And I view it as very analogous to what's going on today.
We're going to get to
the major difference is it was really in one state and in a number 4 or 5 counties in that state where the president's fighting this fight on 4 or 5 fronts now.
I want to get to that when we get to the next segment, but as a young, fresh face, politically back then, I mean, you'd worked on the Hill, of course, but did you have any conception of how just crazy and I don't know what the word I'm looking for, illegal activities could happen in a national election like that? I mean, was that a surprise to you, or did you think it was just kind of business as usual? The Democrats are going to try and steal it.
Matt, I grew up in New York, and I'd seen, had volunteered as a very young man on campaigns and seen some things that were, I would say a little bit shady, but, not determinative in a state like New York, which was, basically a Democratic run state. It rarely turned the outcome of elections, but there were things that were kind of weird. You'd see vans taking the same people from polling place to vote, and you're like, well, how can that happen? But it was really something else. But I did not expect that in a state like Florida when the George W. Bush's brother was the governor, and to see sort of naked politics taking over what is one of our most sacred processes, the vote and election of a president. It was both disheartening at the time, but man, it was motivating. I mean, we were up 19 hours a day or more, making sure that election was fair.
And afterwards, when I remember this story about, on election night, I guess, the president was, or President George W. Bush, he hadn't been president yet, but George W. Bush he got a phone call from Al Gore, and Al Gore conceded. And then a few hours later, somebody got to Gore and said, hey, this thing is probably not over. You need to call the president back. The president called, or Al Gore called Bush back and said, I'm withdrawing my concession. And Bush was speechless from what I understand. And then, of course, what went on, and we came to know people like Jeb Bush, who was the governor. And I think up until then, not unknown, but certainly, wasn't a kitchen common name. And then we met Katherine Harris, who was she the Secretary of State? That's right. She was Secretary of State.
She was.
And then she went on to become a congresswoman, I think, one term. And Now she lives in Sarasota, where she was from. But I remember all the, she was criticized for her makeup and all this other stuff. I mean, all these memories come flooding back. But when we come back after the break, I want to talk to you about, kind of change gears here and talk about the last 4 years of the Trump administration. Nothing technical. I'm not going to make you stick your neck out. And then what you see right now is the president's options kind of moving forward with the vote. You're listening to the Chad Hasty Show. I'm Matt Crow sitting in for Chad. We'll be back right after this. We're back on the Chad Hasty Show. On the line from Washington, D.C. is Nat Wienecke. Nat's one of the vice presidents at the Property Casualty Insurance Association. And we used to work for a guy named David Sampson, and I think David is still there, isn't he, Nat?
He sure is. Sure is a rock-solid Texan.
Well, tell him that his Arlington got hit by a tornado last night, so he probably already knows that. But fast forward, Nat, to now, and I remember back in 2000, the press was already starting to try to sway turnout, and I remember the Florida Panhandle is very conservative. You've got military bases up there. You've got a lot of retired military people who live in the Panhandle. They generally vote conservative, and I think before before the polls closed, the networks were calling Florida for Gore, which was incredibly irresponsible. And unfortunately now, 20 years later, they've completely run amok with calling states before the polls close. And even from a statistical perspective, wide chances of, the races still being able to be won by somebody in the election. I mean, you've got to think that it's only gotten worse since Florida.
Yeah, Matt, that's a really good point. And in my view, it's even more nefarious than that. I mean, the polls in the Panhandle of Florida close an hour later because they're on a different time zone. And it was very clear that Florida was tight. It was winnable for Al Gore. And by the media calling the race before the polls in the states even closed, that has the effect, people in the Panhandle are saying, well, shoot, the candidate I want to vote for, many of them George W. Bush, he's already lost. So, why leave your dinner table to go vote? Let's get home and feed the kids. Let's go to the gym. And people just kind of skip it. And, I believe today that had the media not done that, we wouldn't have even had to recount because, Bush would have gotten thousands and thousands more votes of people that just stayed home because they thought he had lost.
What do you see right now as far as a path forward for President Trump? I mean, from my perspective, and you're a lot closer to it than I am now, but is there any chance, any snowball's chance that we might be able to pull this one out, or do you think it's just about a baked cake?
Yeah, Matt, I think the doors are closing every day, and the chances are literally every second of every day they get more remote. I would highlight to your listeners that today the president is taking the extraordinary step of going into the courtroom himself. He's going to Pennsylvania today to join Rudy Giuliani at that case because I think they realize that they need a court victory very quickly to even be able to ask the questions. I mean, if you look at the common factor in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada is that there were ballots that were put into the ballot box unobserved, and with mail-in voting everywhere, they were not matching signatures. In fact, in Pennsylvania, they told the computer to usually, I believe, it would look for a 60 or 70% match in the signature. They dialed the computer back to a 40% match in signature, and that's unequal treatment. In other places, people had to show their driver's license to be able to vote. So they haven't even been able to prove that there may be faulty ballots in there. And you hear judges saying, well, you don't have enough evidence. Well, they're not even allowed to see the signature matching envelopes. So they're being prevented from even developing the evidence they might need to make a case. And I just think the doors are closing. The states are certifying. The states will all be finished certifying absent a major court decision by the 8th of December. The Electoral College votes on December 15th, and that'll be when that'll really be sort of the end of the process. I mean, he's got a snowball's chance, but man, it is a real snowball.
Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Biden is determined the winner, in some shape or fashion. I guess we're going to have to live with it for 4 years. But considering the 10th Amendment, is there any way that the federal government can is there any way to nationalize the election standards? In other words, take it out of the hands of the hacks and the machines, and actually have federal officials that are more or less independent to go in? I mean, to run these elections, or is it just too broad an operation to even try something like that?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack inside of that question. I think the American people may want to ask themselves whether they want Washington controlling the election everywhere, whether they think they can do it best themselves, understanding that it's an imperfect process. I mean, the largest federal effort that's done every 10 years is the census, and they screw that up every 10 years, and they're screwing up this one. And I worry that the federal government would do a worse job than the states. There have been cases in the past where federal courts have stepped in and put in monitors, for example, court-mandated monitors and so forth, and that is something that could be viable to ensure that the vote is fair.
Well, it just seems to me that, it's been talked about now for the past 2 weeks that people have lost faith in the fact that if they cast a vote, it's not going to make any difference. So, it's a broad question and can't get to the bottom of it here, but, how do we restore faith in a system that most people have, held kind of sacrosanct? And I understand there's shady stuff on the sides, but, something of this magnitude, if in fact it happened, how can people not be discouraged? It's a very demoralizing thing.
Yeah, I think 2 points. The first, going back to your previous questions, remember the Constitution calls on the state legislatures to determine how their electors are chosen for president. So you really would need to amend the Constitution to foundationally change that process. But you're right. People are disenchanted, and quite frankly, it's hard to contemplate the what's going on in this election. I would say, it's kind of like that old saying, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. This is a case where now everybody knows what's going on.
Right,
so
right.
What folks need to do in future elections is they need to volunteer early, and the GOP needs to go to court early to make sure their observers are in the room and be better prepared. Frankly, I think this was predictable and probably a fundamental mistake by the president and his team to not get engaged much early to make sure these votes were
We've got to run, Nat. Thanks so much for joining us. Get down to Georgia and help us out there. You're listening to the Chad Hasty Show.
Great to be with you.
All right. Take care. Happy Thanksgiving.